Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this first webinar of the new academic year. For those who don't know me, I'm Professor David Cantor, Director of the Refugee Law Initiative, the RLI, here at the School of Advanced Study of the University of London. As the convener, I'm pleased to inaugurate this 12th annual RLI seminar series. The series delves into the topic of asylum after COVID-19, the UK New Plan for Immigration in Global Context, and it's organised in partnership with the University of London Refugee Law Clinic. This year's seminar series interrogates the issue of how, as the global COVID-19 pandemic begins to slow, states and other actors are re-engaging with the issue of asylum. The series does so through evaluating distinct aspects of the UK's so-called New Plan for Immigration in broader global context. On the one hand, it thus seeks to provide UK refugee lawyers, scholars, and activists with an understanding of how the UK's approach tessellates with wider global trends. On the other, for those participants interested in refugee protection outside the UK, the series offers insight into wider global changes to asylum in the COVID-19 context, alongside a fine-grained case study of how one influential asylum jurisdiction, the UK, is seeking to reconfigure its approach. This seminar series draws on diverse perspectives from practitioners, researchers, and affected persons to interrogate the law and politics of the new plan in global context. Each of the 6 webinar sessions in the series approaches this issue from a distinct angle, as you can see from the seminar series programme, which is available in full on the RLI website and in the chat right now. In the following 5 seminars, we're going to be focusing on specific measures proposed by the new plan for immigration. For this first seminar, though, we start with a broad general look at how the restrictive approach to asylum, evident in the UK's new plan, relates to wider trends in the response to asylum in other countries across the globe. Today's seminar starts from the proposition that as uncertainty wrought by COVID-19 intersects with shifting underlying political currents in society, a number of governments are pushing new approaches to refugees and asylum. In the United Kingdom, this takes the form of the so-called New Plan for Immigration, a raft of legal and policy measures aimed principally at restricting protection and assistance for refugees and asylum seekers. Many of these measures are in the process of being developed into law by the 2021 Borders and Nationality Bill, currently being debated in Parliament. For those not following these debates, examples of restrictive measures in the new plan include proposals to tighten the legal assessment of refugee status, to introduce a 2-tier system of refugee status in which some refugees receive lesser rights, ostensibly as a form of punishment, to limit access to justice for asylum seekers by introducing admissibility criteria and restricting access to the courts and other fair procedures, attempts to further criminalise refugee movements and to try and push refugees to claim asylum anywhere but the UK. Addressing the broad underlying political and governmental aspects of the new plan in global context, in the seminar today we ask questions around: does the new plan reflect wider global trends in the approach to asylum post-COVID? What does the new plan mean for efforts to harmonise asylum law across Europe and globally? And how do the timing and justification of the new plan relate to current politics in the UK and beyond? We're really fortunate today to have 4 outstanding discussants who can help us to negotiate these questions from a range of perspectives. I'll introduce them in turn before they speak. In terms of format, though, we'll start off with each panellist briefly presenting their initial thoughts on a particular aspect of the seminar topic. We'll then open to a wider discussion format where the panellists can engage with one another and with questions and comments from other participants. During the initial presentations by panellists, then, please do pose your questions by typing them into the chat box. Finally, please do keep your microphones on mute and your videos off unless you're a presenter. We'll also be recording this session, the podcast of which will be available in the coming weeks on the RLI website. So without further ado, let me turn to our first speaker. I'm really pleased that you've been able to join us, Catherine, despite tech problems. So without further ado, Catherine Woolard, who is the Director of the European Council on Refugees and Exiles, will be speaking to the point about recent comparative changes to EU approaches to asylum, especially following Brexit and COVID-19. Catherine, I hope your microphone's working. Over to you. We seem to have a problem. Catherine, I'm afraid we can't hear your mic. Catherine, I'm going to skip you for one moment and turn to our next speaker, if that's okay. So, Mary Ellen, if I can call on you to have the first intervention. Professor Mary Ellen Fullerton of Brooklyn Law School, who'll be talking to some comparative changes to US approaches to asylum during the Trump and Biden administrations. And we'll come back to Catherine next. Mary Ellen, over to you.
Thank you very much. And good morning, everybody from the United States, at least from the East Coast of the United States. I'm joining you for breakfast. And my remit today, as Professor Cantor just said, is to provide a comparative perspective on asylum developments as we've changed from 4 years of the Trump administration to the first year of the Biden administration. I've prepared a few slides that I'd like to share with you, and I am going to try to do that right now. So give me a moment. All right, here we go. So my major takeaway, and you can stop listening now after this next sentence, is that in the United States we are with the metaphor of the pendulum. The swing to the changes drastic and extensive in terms of refugee resettlement and asylum law under the Trump administration have, under the Biden administration, started swinging back. And the Biden administration's announced plans in the overall are to swing back to the generally bipartisan approach of the prior years, of the Obama years, but also of the years prior to Obama. I will give you some specifics about that in a moment. The pendulum is the word I'm using today. The tool so far has been the executive order, not legislation. As many of you will remember from the infamous Muslim ban order of former President Trump during his first month in office, many of the migration and asylum related policies of the Trump administration were put into effect by solely by executive power. And President Biden's team clearly learned that message on the first day in office. President Biden issued 15 executive orders, most of which were about asylum and migration in one way or the other. So that's the tool. We're in a moment of tremendous political hostility right now in the United States, and legislation is a dreamed but not closely held dream right now. So executive action continues to be the way forward. And in terms of some of the comparisons that we can see with regard to the Biden administration and the Trump administration, I've listed a number of the more important ones here. I'll comment that several of them are in litigation. But the general thing I would say is that there's much greater humanitarian protection pursuant to the Trump administration's policies. And I can talk the discussion period about them at greater length. The one I've bolded, refugee resettlement, I want to spend a few moments in my opening remarks to talk a little more about. In the United States, there are two major ways of asylum seekers or refugees receiving safe haven. There's refugee resettlement from overseas, and there's asylum granted at the border or within the territory of the United States. most of the journalism, most of the headlines are about asylum. But actually, in my view, the more important access point is the refugee resettlement process. Is since the Refugee Act of 1980, so 40 years ago, there have been 3.5 million refugees resettled in the United States. Both refugee resettlement and asylum define the eligible participants according to the 1951 convention definitions. So the well-founded fear of persecution on account of 5 grounds. What happens with the refugee resettlement is that resettlement officers, U.S. officers working with NGOs overseas, going to various refugee camps and other settlements, selects and vets refugees there. They come to the United States with United States assistance, meager assistance, I might add, but they're received here by NGOs, local government, and federal government money and help to integrate. They arrive with lawful permanent resident status, and within a year, they have the right to start the naturalization process. So it's a well-trodden avenue for refugee protection in the United States. And as you can see from the numbers in the left column, under the Trump administration, it was decreased and diminished year by year by year. The last year of the Obama administration, the president, in consultation with Congress, targeted 110,000 refugees to resettle from overseas. Trump, when he took office, immediately limited that to 55,000, and each year it not only went lower, but the authorizations were never met. The numbers in yellow are the numbers of refugees that were actually resettled. And just to give you a sense, the average in the years, both under George Bush, under Bill Clinton, under Obama, were roughly 75,000 refugees resettled a year. We were down to 7,600 this past year. So the Biden administration has targeted 125,000 refugees for resettlement in this current fiscal year. And that is a major, major change in swinging the pendulum. With regard to asylum, let me address that more in the discussion period. There are no targeted quotas, there's no limitation, and the process occurs through the immigration courts. And as you can see, roughly in the 40,000, 45,000 asylum grants have occurred in the latest years for which we have statistics. So moving right along, I wanted to give you this quick longitudinal look at the changes in refugee resettlement under prior administrations. The dark black line is the number who have actually been admitted. The light blue line is the number that the president and Congress authorized to be admitted. And we hope to see that continue upward.
Mary-Ellen, got 1 to 2 minutes.
Thank you. The next point I want to make, and this is something that was really important to make visible, is the number of the great backlog in the immigration court, as well as the slow numbers of refugees admitted through refugee resettlement process, has come about through both a policy slowdown, but also a hollowing out of the bureaucracy. So under the Trump administration, the number of people who were competent and skilled and experienced in asylum matters and refugee resettlement matters have been diminished, have been hollowed out, have been reassigned. And this means, as a practical matter, everything takes longer. Clearly, the Biden administration is trying to hire more staff, but as a practical matter, what we see is there's real slowdowns in asylum as well as refugee resettlement. going on to my last real point of my opening remarks, as you may know, there have been several high-profile refugee issues that the Biden administration has been confronting. The U.S. exit from the disastrous war in Afghanistan being one of them, and the numbers of migrants at the southern border being another. These are posing really major political, moral, and legal problems for the Biden administration. And as I leave you with my opening remarks, to the surprise of many scholars and advocates, the Biden administration has retained several important and I would say illegal policies of the Trump administration. And this is something that I'd be delighted to talk about more in the discussion period. But just giving you a brief overview, we're seeing a lot of positive changes, but we're also seeing the retention of some very discouraging policies. So with that, I will sign off for my opening remarks.
Many thanks indeed, Mary Ellen. And it's a really interesting case, the US, particularly the way that you've succinctly presented it, in the sense that it isn't a general trend down, if you like, but it is more of a pendulum, although it seems clear that the pendulum hasn't swung all the way back yet. And the issue of backlogs, I think, is one we can also throw into the mix when we come to the discussion. Many thanks indeed. Catherine, how is your microphone? Shall we see if it's working? Unfortunately, I think it's not. In that case, I'm going to move immediately on to our next speaker. I'm really delighted to welcome to give us another comparative perspective, looking at the trends on asylum in East Africa and Kenya in particular, our colleague Achieng Akena, who is the director of the International Refugee Rights Initiative.
Thank you, David. I think for Africa, it's, I don't know if I can steal Mary Ellen's pendulum. I think but it wouldn't be exactly correct. It'd probably be more of a schizophrenic situation when it comes to asylum seekers and refugees. Despite the global compact, we see that Africa is actually on the receiving end of some of these global policy shifts. Particularly those which are perpetuating externalization of borders and exportation of asylum. While Africa has historically borne the burden of refugee protection, hosting, I think, more than 80% of the world's refugees. Of course, those figures go up and down. It would seem that the countries with more resources and more capability want to continue to transfer those burdens fully to the continent. And what we're seeing now is that resourcing for burden sharing, for asylum seeker and refugee protection is now being caught up in secretive bilateral negotiations and agreements with a lack of clarity of what is actually being negotiated on the table and what is being bargained away, whose rights are up for grabs in places like Uganda and Rwanda that are accepting to process refugee and asylum seekers for countries like the UK and Denmark and the US and Denmark, which we've seen have had these conversations with countries. Recently, I think it was maybe a month or two ago, the AU made a statement about Denmark's new act. I'd hoped that Catherine would have been able to give some background on that, but has oddly remained silent about the other initiatives for externalization and the other global changes when it comes to the global responsibility towards hosting asylum seekers and refugees. It may be that because these are bilateral agreements or the bilateral nature of these agreements sort of makes it a gray area between what comes under regional and national mandates. And that may be why the African Union has been more silent about these other bilateral agreements that have been or are being negotiated. In terms of the countries themselves, we've seen that Kenya, for example, has been quite hostile towards refugees and asylum seekers in the name of securitization and preventing terrorism. There have been many what is the word? There have been many allegations that this has less to do with actual securitization and more to do with political negotiations between Somalia and Kenya. But that has fueled Kenya's insistence on expelling refugees. Uganda, on the other hand, has actually had quite an intake of refugees since reopening its borders after locking down during the COVID period, and has quite a significant increase in its refugees. Rwanda has also been said to be silently engaging in these negotiations and agreements with other countries to host their asylum seekers and refugees. I think maybe the biggest change that we're seeing on the continent is in relation to approaches, reflections, and narratives on migration and human movement on the continent, which have over the years been externally led mostly, but we're seeing a lot more African scholars and African narratives coming out around migration, what it means, how it intersects with other regional arrangements, especially those around free movement and regional integration. And that is, I think it's something exciting to be seen in the near future, sorry. Thank you. I hope I stayed within my 4 minutes allocation.
Very good. Many thanks indeed, Ah-Cheng. It's great to get the perspective, and I really like the way that firstly you've pointed to this generalized trend of securitization on some of these issues in particular parts of Africa, and in studies that we've done recently on the legislation, you can see that being fed through in some places also. I liked also this emphasis that you've given on African states sometimes being, if you like, at the receiving end of the kind of policy concerns that states in the north particularly seem to be obsessed with, but contrasting that with the emergence of intrinsic narratives around migration, which, as you say, I think is a really, really important development. So it doesn't seem that the direction of travel is all one way. There are kind of green shoots of hope, and I like the way that you really brought that out so clearly. And lastly, you, I thought, very, very well drew attention to the bilateral aspect or the regional aspect of some of the developments in that region, particularly thinking about the way in which Kenya's response to Somalis is caught up in bilateral politics, etc. You know, that is an angle that is, I think, really crucial to bring into these sorts of discussions about the direction of travel on the response to asylum. So thank you very, very much for your presentation. Fantastic to have you with us today. Matthew, I'm okay to go to you next. Is that okay? Good. So over next to our third panelist, Professor Matthew Gibney, Director of the Refugee Studies Centre at the University of Oxford, who's going to be talking a little bit about global politics and the sense of the global compact and how this relates to the response to refugees. Matthew, over to you.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you for inviting me. I've really taken seriously my 3 to 4 minutes here, I hope, so we'll see how it goes. But so I've been asked to say something about the global political context of recent UK developments. And it isn't easy to know what to focus on given this quite broad remit. But in the short time that I have, what I want to do is comment on the seeming irony that the new plan for immigration in the UK, which obviously has grave implications for refugee protection in Britain, is appearing hardly more than 2 years after 181 of the world's states signed up to the Global Compact on refugees. Now, the compact itself, of course, was the culmination of 18 months of discussions by states, NGOs, international organizations, and civil society. And it committed the signatory states to act together to achieve 4 major objectives: to ease pressure on refugee hosting countries, to enhance refugee self-reliance, to expand access for refugees to third country solutions, and to support conditions in country of origin for refugee return in safety and dignity. Now, the agreement was hailed at the time of its signing by UNHCR as a historic achievement and a powerful expression of multilateralism that reflected a realistic balance of the interests and aspirations of states. Yet, if we look at Britain's new immigration plan, it seems like a rather brazen move in exactly the opposite direction. The combination of punishing spontaneously arriving refugees, or attempting to provide a new legal basis for interdiction at sea, and new measures to facilitate the offloading of refugees onto other states. These are all effectively unilateral moves by the UK that seem to take us away from the main themes and ideas of the compact. And they're driven by an ethos towards refugees that seems to be anywhere but here. Yet, I think that the dynamics of the compact and those underpinning the UK's new plan are perhaps not as opposed as they first appear. While the global compact certainly has many strands, and I don't want to simplify it in that respect, I think it's fair to say that most Western states, most northern states, were drawn to it because they saw in the compact a potential route for the containment of refugees in the global south, albeit a containment that utilized ostensibly humane tools of development and investment. Improve the conditions of refugees, the reasoning went here, and they'll have less reason to move north. Offer incentives to southern states, and they'll be more likely themselves to continue hosting refugees, keeping the north as much as possible out of the asylum process. Now, given the current state of refugee protection in many countries of the world, and with some exceptions, this kind of what we might call humanitarian containment is certainly not to be sniffed at, I think. Jobs, resources, and opportunities in the south for refugees are much better than perilous passages, the risk of trafficking, and of course, protracted encampment that lasts many years. Moreover, the Global Compact itself seemed pragmatically to accommodate the power and resource inequalities that characterize the international system. For the most part, the North with the money and the South ostensibly with the willingness to take refugees if offered the right amount of resources. Nevertheless, for all its virtues and diversity, the compact was still a global response to refugees built around the principle of keeping refugees away from northern states, and in particular, their twitchy electorates. Indeed, even as the compact was being agreed, and I think we're getting a little bit of this from Marianne's talk as well, more brutal forms of containment were spreading rapidly. In the US, which didn't sign up to it under Donald Trump, it was operating the Remain in Mexico program. Australia was towing back boats to Indonesia. EU states were funding Libyan coast guards to effectively refuel migrants on the Mediterranean, and Italy was passing legislation to punish those who rescue asylum seekers at sea. So it hardly seems surprising in this context, in this pack of Western responses, that the UK is part of a similar kind of process and is currently displaying its own distinct credentials through the new asylum plan. I say distinct credentials, but most of the current proposals are really pilfered from Australian policy over the last decade or two, including two-tiered asylum treatment, punishing refugees for their mode of arrival, of turning back boats, and of the use of third countries to take and to process arriving refugees. Now, it might be objected to what I'm saying that an important part of the Global Compact challenges this idea of containment. And that's the commitment to expanding access to long-term protection through third country solutions, a commitment that requires resettlement by northern countries. And it's true that the UK has, and to me quite remarkably, committed itself to resettling refugees in recent years through the introduction of a number of programs, first for Syrian refugees and more recently for refugees from Afghanistan. Yet even here, the logic of containment still runs like a red thread through it. The British government's justification for its new restrictive measures, this new plan, relies heavily on the argument, again drawn from the Australian case, that spontaneous arrival is itself illegitimate because there are now safe and legal routes to arrive in the UK via resettlement. Spontaneous arrivals then are characterised as queue jumpers or funders of smugglers or single men that are pushing aside vulnerable women and children on their way to the UK. The resettlement of a few then, and in the British case, no more than 5,000 people annually, has thus become wielded by the UK government as a weapon against unsolicited refugees and asylum seekers. So what I would say then is that the UK is clearly not an outlier in terms of the specific changes that are now coming into view, though it has arguably saved Australia from this outlier status. But more than this, the broader trends that underpin the UK response have long been powerfully reflected in global refugee politics, at least in terms of the intervention of northern states.
Many thanks indeed, Matt. A really fantastic presentation to put in context of the global politics, some of the cases that we've been talking about so far. And I'm really pleased that you related the UK specifically to those global trends. And as you say, we have pilfered quite a lot from Australia. And that raises the questions about, to what extent are the outliers now leading policy development in some of these areas? And I think that's one of the really worrying things about the new plan, is that it's you see an accumulation of states behind these measures, which were previously the measures taken by an outlier state. I liked very much also your framing of, what does cooperation really mean at the global level on issues of asylum, and drawing out questions around containment there, but also the possibility, also the reality of inequality in the international system, and how can that be accurately addressed within a particular area of international relations, such as the refugee regime. So thank you very, very much for giving us that very broad panorama in such a short space of time. Very much appreciated. Catherine, should we try your microphone, see if we're in luck? Oh dear, I'm afraid not. Catherine, I think we're going to have to skip your presentation, unfortunately. This is partly the nature of these remote events, that we rely on the technology. I'm really grateful to you for offering to be here, and if you would like to send your notes through, then we can post them alongside the podcast, of course. There are others I know on the panel who've done some work on Europe, and so perhaps we might be happy to take questions relating to Europe as well. Thanks ever so much for joining us, Catherine. I mean, you're very welcome to stay on the call and listen to the discussion, and hopefully we can include your presentation either as a set of notes or invite you to one of the future panel sessions. So this brings us then to the end of our panelist short presentations. And I hope everyone's got a good sense here about where the UK is situated in relation to developments that are taking place in other important nodes of policy formation in the refugee area. The United States, of course, is a leader there, but similarly, East African countries have been very, very vocal around issues like cooperation in the Global Compact, and having the context that Matt's given us around, thinking through containment paradigms in relation to kind of where the UK and other states situate themselves after COVID, I think is a fantastically important area. I'd like to ask participants who haven't been speaking as panelists whether they want to offer comments, questions to the speakers. You're very welcome to put them into the chat. I can see that we've got one question already coming there. And my question to the panelists, as you start digesting the question from Sarah Singer, is to what extent do you think the COVID-19 pandemic has shifted the approach of governments towards the issue of asylum? So has COVID played a specific role in this? And I'm thinking particularly, I suppose, of two areas. Firstly, the border closures more generally. Has that provided, if you like, a fig leaf for greater restrictionism in terms of access? And secondly, in terms of funding, COVID has obviously impacted on public finances, including in the UK, on overseas development assistance, for example, on health spending and so on. Do you think that that has had a direct or indirect impact on the way that states are now trying to position themselves in relation to asylum? So there's a question there about COVID, and then Sarah's question is thinking about the GCI's focus on development aid as a means of containment. How does the UK's new plan sit alongside significant cuts to ODA funding? So I suppose it's a different angle onto that earlier question. So if I can start off in the order that we went with Mary Ellen, what was the role of COVID, do you think, in the US? Was it important or was it less important than the change in administration?
I think it's very important, and I want to connect it with something that Ah-Cheng said about securitization. I think it becomes a new justification, sometimes honest, and most often a political cover for ignoring responsibilities to refugees, for trying to avoid hot political topics of migration. And I think we're seeing that still very strongly in the United States. So I could just say very briefly that just yesterday or the day before yesterday, Harold Koh, who's been an important human rights lawyer and in and out of the administrations in the Democratic realm, kind of former dean of Yale Law School, has resigned from the State Department with a strong public denunciation of the continued reliance on COVID as an avenue of, avenue is the wrong word, as a border, as a fence against, as a wall against allowing refugees and asylum seekers into the United States. So I think it particularly in our political situation where COVID and the responses to it have become very, very politicized, and where states along the southern border are most opposed to common sense public health measures and therefore have a lot of COVID infection. This continues to be a major issue, and I think it's going to go on for quite some time in the United States. So COVID's a major player now.
Thanks, Mary Ellen. Ah-Cheng, I see that you've got a number of other questions. Should we save those to the next round to give you time to digest them? But I wondered if you could just give us a sense of, particularly in the East African context, what role has COVID played in governments thinking, and in fact civil society's thinking there around COVID as well?
I think that COVID has had quite an impact on government policy, but probably not in the way that that we'd expect. I think when COVID began, there was a high expectation from government that there would be resources running in to help the government manage the COVID pandemic, and this was not initially the case. And in that sense, so I will give the example of Uganda, for example. So in that sense, the disappointment of the Ugandan government in the lack of international support for managing the COVID pandemic reflected itself at election time. And we saw a real clampdown on international organizations and foreign government funding to civil society. We saw an increase in government fees, for example, for work permits, almost as if government was saying that we'll get the money any which way. Please don't quote me on that. But that is what it seemed like quite a bit. And we saw as well during, I suppose, yes, COVID played a big role, but we also saw other political factors coming in. So for example, during the election, the US government was very vocal about the democratic space in Uganda and had been vocal since. However, once we had information that Uganda would now host the US's Afghani asylum-seekers, I think they call them, oh, sorry, I've forgotten the official term for them. We stopped hearing about, we stopped hearing the US being vocal about the shutdown of civic space in the country, and we actually saw the government shut down about 50 NGOs, some of which it believed were quote unquote supporting the opposition during the election. And so it's, yes, COVID, but COVID interlaced with several other political factors. It's hard to distinguish and say, yes, just COVID, because it acted as a catalyst towards other political considerations that were already at play.
Many thanks. Thank you, Acheng. That's a very clear view from East Africa, and interesting to see, as you say, the way that facts interlace, and they can in some contexts be very difficult to pick apart and work out, the causal relationships there. Thank you very much. Acheng, you've got a couple of questions in the post, which we'll come to in our next round of questions, but over to you, Matthew, first of all, for the COVID one.
Thank you. So I want to kind of argue that in the UK case, I don't think COVID's played a great role in terms of explaining the new plan. I think that if anything, the new plan was itself kind of over-determined. You had a conservative government, you've got a kind of conservative Home Secretary here, who wanted to kind of show that she was in control, wanted new legislation, wanted to give the appearance of doing something here. And many of the features of the new plan are just consistent, I think, with things that have been talked about in British politics for the last 10 years or so. Where I suppose COVID has played a role is that it has obviously had an effect on how asylum seekers arrive in the UK, because both Brexit and COVID have slowed down the number of lorries coming from France and slowed down traffic generally coming from France to the UK. So that has played a big role in forcing people who are in France but want to get to the UK to claim asylum to take alternative routes by boat. And that's not insignificant in and of itself, even though I don't think that's enough to explain the new plan. But people arriving by boat seems to touch something visceral in publics generally. I don't know whether it's something kind of ancient, the fear of some foreign threat coming by boat, and certainly make very powerful televisual images that can in some ways endanger governments by giving or adding to or giving the impression that the country concerned is under siege. So I would generally say that in the context of Britain, if COVID is a factor, it's a minor one compared to other deeper forces concerning what the Conservative government wants to do in terms of appealing to particularly working class voters. That's not to say that COVID couldn't become more of an issue in the future and be linked even more tightly to issues of asylum, especially in the context of declining living rates as well. Obviously, asylum seekers become one target that can be picked out.
Unless, of course, they're lorry drivers, which refers to the fuel shortages in the UK at the moment.
Absolutely.
Lorry drivers.
It's true, there's a lot going on.
Okay, so thanks very much, Matt. And I think, you've touched on something really important there, which is, in the UK's case as an island, a bit like Australia, the shift that COVID and other factors have produced in the modes of arrival of those seeking to claim asylum. And of course, the lockdown of the restrictions on flying from quite a number of African countries, Asian countries as well, has also played into that. That is perhaps an indirect effect of COVID that's fed some of the discourse about boat arrivals. Now, I can see that we've got a number of interesting questions that have been posed. We have about 10 minutes left. So I'm going to go in the same order as before and ask if you could pick particularly on one question. I'm going to limit you to just 2 or 3 minutes. So Mary Ellen, would you be happy to pick one of the questions that's been posed and take a run at it? Still reading, perhaps. Shall I go quickly to Achiang? Achiang, you've had a little while to digest the 2 questions that were posed to you. What would you like to just give a brief response, your thoughts on those issues, please?
Yes, I think both Nick and Sarah's questions are related because it's about regional arrangements. I think Nick asks whether we are seeing some of those regional arrangements in policy or practice. I think we're seeing them at AU policy level, but not so much at country practice level. We're seeing them at least in the rhetoric. In 2019, which was the year for refugees, the AU year for refugees and asylum seekers and migrants, the AU was quite clear about creating an Africa where no one was a refugee, so that everybody had a home, no matter where they are on the continent. And that rhetoric, unfortunately, COVID happened in 2020, and it seemed that all the activities that were planned post the year didn't quite make it to the table. But the idea there was really to try and push for the regional arrangements to become more of practice, and for the regional arrangements to go beyond just migrants, but to start also assisting people who are forcibly displaced. Sarah asks whether the having more African voices has a potential to help African states resist collectively or individually the arrangements or the global trend towards pushing or moving asylum, externalization of asylum. And I would say that, yes, that actually began quite a few years ago when Europe declared a crisis or a migration crisis and there was all the images of Africans drowning in the Mediterranean. I think the AU's policy response was to adopt the free movement protocol for Africans, or to ask for the free movement protocol to be developed and adopted. And so I think there is already that recognition at a political level that increasing legal ways of moving in Africa and increasing African migration and African trade is the response to the rejection of, I guess that's how they perceive it, the rejections of Africans from other so-called Western countries. That would be my quick response. I hope I adequately covered that, Nick and Sarah.
Many thanks indeed, Etienne. That's fantastic. You managed to cover both questions very comprehensively. Coming back, Mary Ellen, I wondered if one of the earlier questions might be one that you'd like to respond to. I noted that whilst you were talking about the resettlement programme, you had a question about how do resettlement programs, humanitarian schemes, etc., know that sleeping terrorist cells are not amongst the migrant population. I think, it's a question that speaks to securitization and procedure. I wondered if in a minute you just wanted to briefly explain the kind of rigor with which resettlement procedures are undertaken in the United States to put that on record.
Yes, thank you, David. The resettlement process includes, and this is particularly true since 9/11, so since 2001, really 2 years worth of different kinds of checks against all sorts of databases, and many of us think overly checking, but the concern clearly for the administration in power is to make sure that there's nobody who's ever been resettled as a refugee who does anything wrong, and certainly who doesn't do anything which could be considered a terrorist act. There are multi-level checks, fingerprints, criminals, international efforts, as well as personal screening. It continues to be, contentious politically, but I think really not genuinely, rather as a political cudgel. And the other, if I could make two very brief points, I wanted to pick up on something Matthew said about the modes of arrival. And I think a country's images of how asylum seekers arrive is incredibly important to the politics. And I think the sense of the government essentially being in control, whether that's true or not, is very important. And it's one of the things that's challenging the Biden administration right now, because we have such a big southern border. It's hard to be, no matter what kind of walls or centers you have, it's hard to be in control of all of it. But it's unsettling to the public to think the government isn't in control. And the contrast I want to make here is between the US and Canada. Asylum seekers can walk into the US because of our southern border. Very few, some, but very few walk into Canada. And I think that puts the respective administrations in very different situations, even though they're both obliged by the same international norms and laws. So let me leave it at that, but I just wanted to highlight that because the recent vivid images of many Haitians in the southern border of the United States who have essentially walked on perilous journeys there, rather than receiving sympathy from a lot of the public, have been viewed as threats. And I think it's because of this sense of uncontrolled arrivals.
Thanks ever so much, Mary Ellen. I'm going to give you, Matthew, the last word. There's a couple of questions there which have a politics angle, or at least they look to have a politics angle to me as a non-politics academic. But one of them is about whether the balance has shifted in favour of legitimate national interests post-COVID. So have national interests shifted as a result of COVID politically? And a second one is about the political ideological shift and whether that has a role to play in the international politics. So if you'd like to speak to one or both of those questions or respond to the other points made by panelists, you have the last word.
Thank you, David. So I wanted to actually just start with Sarah Singer's observation, which was to me, and it was about thinking about the global compact's focus on development aids as a means of containment. How does the UK's new plan to cut ODA, overseas development aid funding, fit with that. I mean, I think that's a really, really good example of, I suppose, what I was trying to get across in the paper, that if you're going to embrace something like humanitarian containment, which I think is in many respects the rationale behind Western government support for the Global Compact, I think what's more powerful and motivator is the containment than the humanitarian dimension here. And quite a brilliant example of this is what Sarah has just shown there, that the UK has recently just slashed overseas development funding, while obviously is putting resources now towards the new immigration plan. And so the elements, to a certain extent, of the Global Compact here, which would seem to suggest that you should have a lot of your energy, a lot of your focus on that funding, are really out of kilter, and the containment element is the most powerful thing there. In terms of how it's specifically funded, I'm not sure. That's an interesting question as well, to what extent Global Compact funding will come from Treasury, or to what extent it, and to what extent some of the things that the UK government ostensibly wants to do with the new plan are going to come from Home Office budgets. But some of them will involve and take money if they're seriously interested in convincing, perhaps bribing other countries to take refugees either back. Some of that money is already being spent on France, 90 million to control the borders there, or to process refugees in other countries. So I think that's a really interesting question. So there's the broader question of whether interests shift in the aftermath of COVID, which is a very, very big question. And I think it's a little bit too early to tell. Obviously, if COVID drags on and the economic consequences of it last for a long time, it could help fuel, through perhaps unemployment and low wage rates, more hostility towards refugees, which in democratic countries will always be reflected in governments. I certainly think that if it does shift national interest, they will not be in ways that are positive towards asylum and refugee protection generally. So I think that's still an open question at the moment. But I do think it's important to watch this space, because obviously there is a link, as I suggested before, that in times of economic austerity, in times of insecurity, Western states often plump for very restrictive migration and asylum policies, and that is a real danger.
Well, I think a big open question is always a good place to leave what has been an excellent discussion. That's all we've got time for now, but allow me to draw proceedings to a close by expressing my great thanks to colleagues at the RLI, at the Refugee Law Clinic, our three fantastic presenters today, Chen, Mary Ellen and Matthew, and also to each of you for participating remotely in this session. We look forward to seeing you for the second seminar in this series, where we start to dig down into some of the detail about the kind of measures that the new plan envisages. This session is called Transforming Refugee Status, Definitions and Discrimination, and it's going to take place on Wednesday, 3rd of November at the same time. Until then, many thanks again and goodbye, everyone.